Welcome to Dialogue. I want to start today with an idea. It's a thesis that, when you hear it in the context of global security policies, well, it sounds pretty radical. But when you actually break down the evidence, it's shockingly simple and I think undeniable.
Oh,
The single most reliable way to reduce conflict, to stop long-term instability, and to ease the pressure that leads to massive migration is through intentional strategic economic development, not destruction.
and there it is. The ultimate cognitive dissonance in global affairs. Because if you just state that premise, that stability requires solvency, that people with jobs tend not to join militias, it sounds like basic common sense.
Of course it does.
And yet for decades, the dominant global security policy has effectively been the complete opposite. It's been find a key region, destabilize it, starve it of capital, and then act completely surprised when that region collapses into violence and disorder.
It's this flawed assumption that instability is somehow a pathway to peace, or at the very least, a pathway to control.
Right. And the most galling part of that cycle, for me, is the policy response, when that instability produces exactly what it's designed to produce. You get refugees, you get migrants, you get collapsing states.
And the conversation immediately shifts.
Immediately, it becomes all about border control, emergency aid, and humanitarian crises, rather than ever addressing the initial strategic error. It's a kind of willful blindness to cause and effect.
A perfectly engineered problem that we then act shocked by.
And what's so compelling about this, if you really dig in, is that the proof isn't theoretical. It's not some academic fantasy. It's hidden in plain sight.
Where?
In the few times we have actually committed to long-term rebuilding, even in places that were, our sworn enemies, we have historical blueprints that prove economic investment works faster and more effectively than military intervention at generating long-term security.
We just consistently choose the other path.
We choose the path that yields immediate, predictable chaos.
Okay, let's unpack this, because our mission today is to really dive deep into that evidence and demonstrate why security is what we'd call a lagging indicator. It doesn't come first. It follows economic stability.
Right.
And we're going to argue that rebuilding ruined economies isn't some form of utopian charity. It is the ultimate cold, hard, strategic self-interest. You stabilize your neighbors so they don't become your overwhelming, expensive future problems.
And to start that journey, I think we have to fundamentally redefine what we think poverty is. Because the current definition often carries way too much moral baggage.
For generations, the narratives around poverty in vulnerable regions have been poisoned by this framing of it as a kind of moral or cultural failure.
Oh, absolutely.
You hear this persistent, insidious idea that certain regions or populations just lack the inherent virtue or the work ethic that's required for prosperity. And that lens, it's not just condescending.
It's completely blinding.
It completely blinds us to the structural, mechanical reality of what economic failure actually is. So if we strip it down, poverty isn't a lack of virtue, it's pressure. Crushing, suffocating, structural pressure.
And if we get forensic about it, that pressure is physical, it's tangible, it's systemic. When an economy collapses, and it could be from war, from sanctions, from just plain institutional failure, the problem isn't just that salaries drop. I mean, that's the surface level symptom.
Right, that's what you see on the news.
What's really happening is that the fundamental operating system of society is breaking down. Jobs just vanish. Infrastructure stops being maintained. So your electricity starts to flicker, your clean water supply becomes erratic, and crucially, your institutions, they just rot.
What does that mean in practice? Institutions rot.
It means property rights become meaningless. The piece of paper that says you own your house is now just a piece of paper. Contracts are completely unenforceable, and your currency, the money in your pocket, becomes worthless.
A complete loss of legal and economic certainty. I mean, when inflation hits 4 digits or the bank simply closes its doors and locks them, you're not worried about planning your retirement.
No.
You're worried about whether the single bill you're holding will be worth enough to buy a loaf of bread by the end of the hour.
Exactly. The basic social contract, this core idea that if you work, you can feed yourself and protect your family, that contract is nullified. It's void.
So what happens then?
When that happens, violence shifts. It goes from being a social pathology, an aberrant crime, into something else entirely. It becomes a perfectly rational, albeit incredibly dangerous, survival strategy.
It's a career choice.
It becomes a career choice. The vast majority of people don't want to engage in violence, but when the legal economy offers you a 0% chance of survival, and joining an armed group offers you, say, a 5% chance, the choice for many becomes tragically clear.
And this structural breakdown is the engine.
Yeah.
It's the engine driving mass displacement, which is why we have to see migration as this massive, unmistakable economic signal.
It is the ultimate signal.
People aren't just abandoning their homes, their culture, their ancestral land on a whim. They are doing it because staying has become untenable. It's a virtual death sentence, or at least a guarantee of absolute failure for them and their children.
It is the ultimate cost-benefit analysis. As some of the material we looked at points out so clearly, nobody risks drowning in the Mediterranean or suffocating in a cargo container for the sheer adventure of it.
No.
We are watching people weigh the monumental, terrifying risk of leaving everything they know, facing smugglers, deserts, oceans, against the near certainty of starvation, violence, or total destitution if they stay put.
And in that scenario, leaving is the safer bet.
It's the more rational economic calculation.
Right.
That's the key.
And that is the essential insight. Conflict doesn't just spontaneously generate from some abstract ideological clash. It leaks out of desperation when the economic floor completely drops out.
Right.
When the state can no longer provide basic wages or education or even food security, a market opens up. A market for control, for power, for resources.
And there are always groups happy to fill that vacuum. Armed groups, whether they're criminal organizations or political militias, are exceptionally good at this because chaos.
Yeah.
Chaos can be monetized.
This is a point that is so often missed in Western policy discussions, which tend to laser focus on ideology.
Always on ideology. What do they believe?
Exactly, but while ideology might provide the banner or the flag, it's the lack of food and income that provides the actual army.
100%.
Let's talk more about crime then, because this concept of an economic floor completely reframes the difference between a stable, wealthy nation and a collapsing one. I mean, crime exists everywhere.
Everywhere.
We see insider trading on Wall Street, massive fraud in the city of London, violent crime in every major city on the planet.
Indeed. But the critical difference is not morality, as you pointed out. The difference is the economic margin. It's the institutional capacity of that society to absorb conflict.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. In a wealthy, stable country, crime is it's constrained.
It's contained.
Right. When someone commits fraud or theft or even a violent act, the core economic engine of the city or the country, it doesn't just sputter and die.
No, the system absorbs the shock.
The judicial system, the police, the insurance markets, they're all large enough, stable enough, and predictable enough to process that conflict. Crime is the exception. It's an aberration committed by individuals who often have other alternatives, even if they choose the illicit path.
Now contrast that with an economically devastated country. The very nature of crime changes completely. It stops being an activity that's contained by the system, and it transforms into the primary economic system itself.
So crime becomes an industry.
It becomes the industry. It replaces legitimate employment and institutions on a massive scale.
Can you walk us through the specific mechanics of that transformation? What does it actually look like on the ground when a militia becomes the central employer in a town?
It's terrifyingly organized. It's not just random chaos. When the formal banking sector collapses, for example, criminal networks step in to handle illicit finance, money laundering, currency exchange.
They become the new banks.
They become the new banks. When legitimate employers, let's say a state-run utility company or a large factory, when they fail and shut down, militias literally take over the physical infrastructure. They monetize that chaos through systematic extortion. They set up checkpoints and tax everything that moves. They smuggle high-value resources like oil or minerals or timber. And of course, human trafficking becomes a core business.
So violence is no longer just a means of control. It is the entire job market.
It is the job market. For a young person in that environment, the most reliable source of capital, the highest paying job with the most security, is often organized violence.
So if the government can't deliver a steady paycheck, the local warlord can. And that stability, as perverse and brutal as it is, it wins out over state dysfunction every single time.
Precisely. And this leads us to the crucial lesson that was learned, often completely by accident, by most first world countries. Stability is built on predictability, not on virtue.
They didn't become peaceful because their citizens suddenly became morally superior.
Not at all. They became peaceful because their economies became predictable.
Predictability sounds so, so unglamorous. But it underpins everything we take for granted. What are the core ingredients of that predictable environment?
There are three non-negotiables, I'd say. First, what you could call economic certainty. Jobs exist, They pay a stable wage that's adjusted for inflation, and people can actually rely on their savings not being wiped out overnight.
Okay.
Second, systemic integrity. The food system works. The basic utilities work reliably. People aren't consumed with the worry of starving or freezing next week.
The basics of survival are covered.
They're covered. And third, and this might be the most vital of all, is legal certainty. This means people can plan 5 years into the future. They can sign a contract knowing a court will actually enforce it. They can purchase property knowing the title won't be stolen by an armed official a month later.
It's the difference between feeling invested in the system and feeling like the system is actively working against you. It's much easier to respect the law when the law doesn't feel like a prank being played on the poor.
Exactly. If you work 60 hours a week, and then hyperinflation wipes out all your earnings overnight, or a corrupt official shuts down your small business on a whim, the state loses all moral authority in your eyes.
Why would you play by its rules?
You wouldn't. And we can see this historical trend play out in such dramatic fashion. I mean,
Yeah.
think of Western Europe after World War II. Think of Japan after its reconstruction, or the rise of South Korea after massive concerted industrial investment.
All these places achieve stability not through more self-destruction, not through punishment.
But through intentional, massive economic injections. These were designed to ensure a viable economic future for the vast majority of their citizens. Stability, in these cases, was secured by solvency.
This brings us to the Marshall Plan.
To truly ground this idea of strategic investment, we have to look at the Marshall Plan. It really stands as the gold standard case study, and frankly, it's scandalous how often we ignore its central lessons. It proves we knew this formula 75 years ago.
So paint the picture for us. What was Europe like in 1945? It wasn't just physical destruction, was it? The social fabric was just as torn apart.
The physical damage was immense. I mean, cities were just leveled, infrastructure was gone. But the deeper crisis was economic and social. Europe was literally starving. Production had dropped to catastrophic lows. Germany, in particular, was facing not only hunger, but the complete collapse of its currency and any institutional credibility.
A perfect petri dish for extremism.
A perfect petri dish. This desperation was fueling mass political instability. And you have to remember the context. The very real threat of Soviet-backed communism spreading westward across the entire continent was omnipresent. It was the #1 fear.
So the U.S. faced this monumental choice. Do they follow the traditional policy of punishing the defeated nations, the Treaty of Versailles playbook, to ensure Germany could never rise again? Or do they try something radically different?
Exactly. Do they invest heavily in rebuilding the entire continent's economic ecosystem, including their former enemies? The initial inclination, led by voices seeking retribution, was punishment. But cooler heads prevailed. And they were driven by pure, calculated, strategic self-interest, not some sudden wave of humanitarian concern.
This wasn't charity.
It was not charity. The plan, officially the European Recovery Program, recognized a fundamental truth. You cannot contain Soviet influence by imposing democracy on starving, freezing, and unemployed populations. It doesn't work. The primary goal was to make capitalism and democratic stability look like the vastly more profitable, life-sustaining option.
So this investment wasn't just, dropping pallets of cash from planes. It was highly calculated. What did the Marshall Plan actually invest in, and what was the scale of it?
It was a massive coordinated effort. It totaled around $13 billion between 1948 and 1952, which in today's dollars is well over $150 billion. And it wasn't just cash aid. It was capital goods, it was machinery, it was critical raw material.
Things to build things with.
Things to build things with. The money flowed into rebuilding foundational sectors like coal and steel production, which were crucial for all other manufacturing. It financed modern agricultural inputs, tractors, fertilizer, to ensure Europe could feed itself again. And crucially, it was contingent upon the recipients cooperating economically with each other. This laid the groundwork for what would eventually become the European Union.
It's the ultimate counterintuitive strategy, isn't it? You spend years crushing your enemy militarily, and then you immediately send them sophisticated, heavy machinery and capital to rebuild their factories.
And the result, startlingly, was, and this is shocker, that feeding people and giving them predictable employment radically reduces the appeal of extremism.
Oh, no.
It starved the very environment that bred radical politics in the first place.
And the outcomes were, they were profound and they were long-lasting.
Absolutely. You saw rapid economic revival. Industrial output in the countries that received Marshall Plan aid rose by something like 35% within just a few years. This revival stabilized their political systems, it reduced internal conflict. I mean, think about France and Germany finally becoming economic partners instead of mortal rivals. And it cemented the lasting alliances that define the modern global structure, namely NATO.
But let me play devil's advocate for a second, because this is the criticism you often hear today. People will say, isn't that comparing apples to oranges?
How so?
The U.S. was rebuilding established, industrialized societies, Germany, France, Italy. These were societies that had institutional memory, they had a highly skilled workforce, even after the war. The challenge today is often rebuilding structure where robust national institutions barely existed in the first place, or were totally shattered by decades of conflict.
That's a vital counterargument, and it's a fair one. It brings us back to the nuance of what strategic investment actually means. While the context was different, the underlying mechanism holds true. The Marshall Plan wasn't just giving money to factories. It was giving money to restore capacity and predictability. In today's fragile states, we aren't starting from zero, you're right. We're often starting from negative territory.
The ground has been salted.
The ground has been salted. So the investment must therefore be geared toward building the foundation that the Marshall Plan recipients already had. That means building governance capacity, legal predictability, and basic, reliable infrastructure. Water, power, roads, that allows private enterprise to even exist. The principle remains the same. Stability requires a functional economy.
So the lesson isn't just invest money, it's invest strategically in the infrastructure of certainty.
That's it, precisely. And the long-term benefits of the Marshall Plan prove that investing strategically in your neighbors leads to greater security and prosperity for the investor. It is the very definition of strategic self-interest.
So we have the blueprint for success. Now let's pivot to the opposite side of the coin. What happens when, instead of that sustained strategic investment, the global policy is intentional economic destruction or just prolonged destabilization?
This is where the pattern is not just clear. It is painfully, tragically consistent. We have spent the last few decades running a series of, you could say, controlled experiments in destabilization. And they've largely been executed through crippling sanctions, direct military invasion, or swift regime change without any serious plan for what comes next.
No plan for concurrent economic state building.
None. And the analytic question we need to stop avoiding is simple. What is the inevitable result when a society's foundational infrastructure, its power, its water, its jobs, its police force, is intentionally destroyed?
The answer time and time again is that it does not encourage entrepreneurship.
No. Nor does it magically encourage democratic self-governance. It encourages immediate, desperate survival. And that survival instinct manifests as organized violence.
So let's run through the case studies where destruction prevailed, and let's notice how the consequences just echo each other, regardless of the continent or the culture.
Let's start with Iraq. You have decades of crippling international sanctions that specifically targeted what's called dual-use infrastructure. That means components for power grids and water purification plants were denied for years. This was followed by an invasion that deliberately and systematically decimated the state apparatus.
And critically, the decision to implement de-Baathification and to dissolve the entire Iraqi army.
That decision meant that hundreds of thousands of educated, capable, and importantly armed individuals lost their livelihoods overnight.
That is 500,000 men suddenly unemployed, highly trained in violence, with absolutely no economic stake in the new system you're trying to build. That doesn't create peace. It creates a massive job recruitment pool for militias and insurgents.
Exactly. The economic foundation, the state's ability to generate power, to run hospitals, to provide wages, was shattered. The resulting power vacuum was immediately filled by militias, which stepped in to control key economic revenue streams, like oil smuggling, resource distribution, and simple extortion rackets.
And the long-term instability that resulted from that, which led directly to the rise of groups like ISIS, was a predictable economic consequence.
It was a direct, predictable consequence of destroying the state's ability to employ and sustain its own population.
We see a similar, though maybe swifter, collapse in Libya after the regime change there. The swift removal of the centralized governing structure, which relied almost entirely on state oil revenues, led to an instantaneous economic shock.
The oil economy just evaporated for the central government, leading to fragmentation. The country immediately splintered into what are essentially regional economic fiefdoms. Armed groups took physical control of ports, oil fields, and key transit points.
So for the average person, the line between the legal economy and the illicit economy just vanished.
It vanished. Smuggling, human trafficking, and extortion became the only functioning economic sectors. And this turned the country into a primary transit point for migration and illegal trade straight into Europe. The destruction of central economic control was the genesis of the current sprawling security crisis.
Then there is Afghanistan. After decades of war, the economy that existed there was largely artificial, wasn't it? It was almost entirely dependent on foreign military spending and aid inflows.
Completely. And so when that aid vanished in 2021, the collapse was instant. The economy had no deep, resilient roots of its own that were capable of sustaining the population. For most rural citizens, the only resilient, functioning economic enterprise outside of that foreign support had always been the illicit drug trade.
So when the legal economy failed, the population defaulted to the most available source of capital.
They defaulted to what worked. The result wasn't peace. It was economic desperation leading to mass hunger, a huge brain drain of skilled workers, and, of course, continued outward migration.
And finally, a place like Haiti, which just suffers from these repeated short-term interventions that fail over and over again to provide any sustained, constructive economic investment.
Haiti is the perfect example of the cycle of institutional fragility. Every intervention focuses on immediate political stabilization, followed by a quick withdrawal. The result is that the basic infrastructure, the ports, the electrical grids, communication networks, it never achieves reliability.
Which means local industry can't compete.
It can't compete. Viable economic futures are perpetually out of reach. And when people can't reliably power a factory, they can't run a legitimate business. And that economic vacuum is inevitably filled by organized gangs who monetize the scarcity through control and violence.
The truly baffling part of all of this is that global leaders consistently express surprise.
Every time.
They express genuine surprise when these perfectly predictable outcomes occur after a nation's ability to feed itself, employ itself, and govern itself has been systematically eliminated. We destroy the financial and physical foundations of the house, and then we ask, with genuine bewilderment, why the residents are suddenly walking down the road toward us.
It's a performance of surprise at this point.
This denial brings us right back to migration. In the countries receiving migrants, the story is often framed as a surge, a crisis, or even a moral failing on the part of the migrant. This idea that people are leaving because they are lazy or just opportunistic.
We have to flip that lens.
We have to. Migration is critical, structural feedback. It is a loud, clear, unmistakable economic signal.
People are casting the ultimate vote. They're voting with their feet. They leave when the marginal benefit of maintaining cultural ties, being near family familiarity, is utterly outweighed by the economic certainty of failure, violence, or death.
When wages disappear, when safety collapses, when the future shrinks to zero.
The economic calculation decisively favors leaving. The cost of paying a smuggler, risking your life and starting over in a strange country, is calculated as being less than the cost of staying home.
So if migration is the signal of economic collapse, then economic success should show the opposite signal. It should show stabilization and eventually the slowing or even reversal of that outward flow.
That's the dynamic. That's exactly what we see. When local economies thrive and predictability returns, several crucial dynamics reverse. First, as you said, outward migration slows dramatically. Why would you take an enormous risk if opportunity exists at home?
Right.
Second, the critical brain drain starts to reverse as skilled, educated citizens find reasons to return home. And most powerfully, diasporas, those who already left and found success elsewhere, they begin to invest capital back into their home regions. They send money, they start businesses.
And that reinforces local strength. It creates a self-sustaining positive feedback loop.
That investment loop is the ultimate feedback mechanism for stability.
So let's look at some concrete examples where sustained building, even after massive devastation, delivered exactly this kind of security.
Vietnam is a stunning case study. This was a country absolutely devastated by decades of warfare, suffering immense structural damage and human loss. Yet, in the decades since, the policy focus shifted dramatically to market-oriented reforms, a policy known as OI, or renovation.
And that transition was key. It was a fundamental shift from a centrally planned economy to one focused on export-led manufacturing and, crucially, attracting foreign direct investment.
Precisely. They focused intently on creating the necessary predictability we talked about. They invested heavily in infrastructure, they stabilized their currency, and they streamlined the regulatory hurdles for foreign companies to come in and set up shop.
And the result?
The result is Vietnam transforming into a rapidly rising manufacturing hub. Large multinational corporations, particularly in electronics and textiles, big names like Samsung and others, have poured billions into the country, creating millions of predictable middle-class jobs.
That simple shift in the economic incentive structure meant people stopped joining militias or risking their lives on boats.
Why would they? The opportunity cost of violence became too high. It was a bad career move.
It's a textbook example. When a factory opens and offers a predictable wage, healthcare benefits, and a future, that job is fundamentally more attractive than the incredibly high-risk, short-term gain offered by organized crime.
Another fascinating, if different example is Rwanda, following the devastating 1994 genocide and the total societal collapse that ensued.
A country that many wrote off as a failed state for good.
Completely. But the government focused on post-conflict development with remarkable clarity. Instead of relying purely on resource extraction or foreign aid, they bet heavily on ICT information and communications technology, and on building governance capacity.
So they focused on creating an environment where businesses could actually operate efficiently.
Yes. They simplified business registration to a matter of hours. They fought corruption with a vengeance. And they invested heavily in education and health. Now, while the political system there certainly has its complexities and its critics, the economic focus on stability and predictability delivered significantly more growth and security than anyone could have anticipated in the 1990s.
They prioritized rebuilding the ability of citizens to earn a living and participate in a modern economy.
And that made the social fabric far more resilient to shocks.
And then, just on the sheer scale of poverty reduction, we have to look at China. And we have to be clear here, we're isolating this purely on the economic focus, regardless of one's political viewpoint, because the numbers are just undeniable.
Absolutely. The massive, sustained success in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of agrarian poverty and into the industrial and service economies created profound internal stability. When you create vast numbers of people who now have access to predictable employment, education, and the ability to build wealth, the motivation for internal conflict or for outward migration drops immensely.
You give people a stake in the system.
A massive stake in maintaining the system. You do not have to endorse the political ideology to notice that the stability delivered by radical economic opportunity is real.
So let's zoom out from the individual state level for a moment. Why do these localized economic collapses immediately become global security problems that land on everyone's doorstep? It's not just a local issue.
Because the global economic structure itself is fundamentally imbalanced and, I would argue, unsustainable.
It's economic physics.
It is. We live in a world where nearly infinite capital and opportunity are concentrated in a few specific geopolitical regions, North America, Western Europe, parts of Asia, while huge swaths of the global south face virtually zero predictable opportunity. This asymmetry is the source of tremendous, unavoidable pressure.
And you cannot globalize communication. You can't allow everyone to see the lifestyle and wealth of the developed world on their phones, on Instagram, and then try to localize poverty, expecting populations to just remain content in deprivation and institutional failure.
That economic asymmetry is a bomb waiting to go off. The pressure has to equalize somewhere.
And the consequences of this concentration are predictable. They spill across borders and they morph into our security problems.
Right. When this pressure builds, you get massive, often sudden, migration crises that overwhelm systems in the recipient countries. That demographic pressure then fuels political backlash, isolationism, and xenophobia in those same recipient countries, destabilizing their own internal politics.
And the conflict itself, rooted in that scarcity, spills over into neighboring regions. It destabilizes supply chains, trade routes, everything.
This dynamic isn't really about cultural incompatibility or religious difference at its core. It is structurally determined. It's almost mathematical. Too much economic pressure in one region, too much capital concentration in another.
Which forces us to ask the ultimate critique of current policy. If economic development works so demonstrably well, if we have the blueprint with the Marshall Plan, the evidence from Vietnam, from Rwanda, why is economic destruction, short-term military intervention, or just prolonged neglect still the default policy preference globally?
I think the answer is cynical, but it's also unavoidable once you factor in political and financial timelines.
It's the only answer that makes sense.
It is. Destruction is immediate. It's often highly profitable for specific defense sectors, and it's politically simple. A bombing campaign can be executed in a few weeks, it can be declared a victory by a politician, and it can generate positive news cycles before the next election. Reconstruction, stability, development. That is slow. It's complex, it's unglamorous, it requires decades of sustained political will, transparent governance, and a high initial investment that doesn't show an immediate flashy return. Frankly, for those whose business models rely on the perpetual turn of conflict and instability, peace is terrible for quarterly earnings.
It's the constant choice between a short-term, high-profit strategy and a long-term, high-complexity investment strategy.
And globally, the short term almost always wins, even though it costs exponentially more in the long run through recurrent security crises, through migration management, through endless counterterrorism.
So we have to address the most common critique that's leveled against this idea of development, which is that old saying, you can't just throw money at problems.
And that critique is entirely correct if that's what you're doing. Dumping aid indiscriminately or just sending pallets of cash is a recipe for corruption and dependency. It doesn't work.
So it's not about throwing money.
It's not. Strategic, sustained investment requires surgical precision. It's not about endless charity. It's about targeted, conditional capital aimed at building fundamental capacity from the ground up.
So given our deep dive into what causes collapse, this
Yeah.
loss of predictability, what does this necessary strategic investment actually look like in practice? Where does the money need to go to produce genuine long-term stability?
It has to be directed at the critical infrastructure that underpins predictability. I think you can break it down into four core areas. First, robust physical infrastructure. That means reliable power grids, functional roads and ports, and increasingly modern digital connectivity. You simply can't run a factory or a hospital without reliable electricity and transport.
The basics that we literally never think about until they fail.
Exactly. Second is building local industry capacity. This is about moving regions away from purely resource extraction, which benefits a very small elite, and toward value-added manufacturing or service industries that create widespread, stable employment. This requires trade access, capital investment, and risk-sharing mechanisms from the developed world.
Okay, what's third?
Third is human capital investment. Targeted funding for education, not just universities, but crucial vocational training and public health care. You have to ensure the population is healthy and skilled enough to actually participate in a modern economy.
And the fourth area is the hardest, but arguably the most important. It touches on that legal certainty we discussed earlier.
Absolutely. Governance capacity and legal infrastructure. This means funding the boring stuff, funding the institutions that ensure transparency, that have real anti-corruption measures, and crucially, a functioning civil court system that can enforce contracts and protect property rights.
Because no entrepreneur, local or foreign, will invest a dime if they know their factory can be seized arbitrarily.
Or that their contract can be torn up without any legal recourse. Why would you take that risk?
That entire approach is infinitely harder and requires so much more political stamina than simply launching an airstrike. It is slower, it's less cinematic, but historically it's the only approach that is demonstrably effective at preventing future security crises and stemming migration.
And this brings us right back to our central argument. Security follows stability. You cannot patrol desperation into peace. Military force can suppress a conflict temporarily, but it is fundamentally incapable of eliminating the underlying economic incentive for violence to return.
It's an expensive band-aid.
It's a very expensive band-aid applied to a systemic structural breakdown.
That is the ultimate takeaway, isn't it? Security emerges when people have a stake in the system, when their futures feel real and attainable, and when violence loses its economic incentive because the opportunity cost of chaos just becomes too high.
Think about the core failure of military-led solutions. No amount of military checkpoints can ever replace a steady paycheck backed by a functioning, stable economy. A checkpoint only reinforces who has power right now. A predictable, regular paycheck backed by a functioning bank and a reliable market gives people a deep, personal reason to side with the system, not against it. That is how you build long-term, self-sustaining security from the ground up.
So let's try to summarize what this different global strategy, one that prioritizes economic development over immediate intervention, what would that actually look like in practice?
It would look like a relentless focus on capital deployment being viewed as a primary tool of diplomacy. We would see infrastructure investment replacing military invasion. We would see long-term predictable trade relationships replacing coercive sanctions that are designed to starve a population into submission.
So it means viewing the construction of a power grid in a fragile state as a far more potent tool of national security than deploying a carrier group offshore.
Exactly. And the provocative thought attached to that model is simple yet profound. You create far fewer enemies when fewer people are desperately poor. Desperation is the fuel for radicalization. Because when you have nothing left to lose, no job, no house, no future, any gamble, no matter how extreme or violent, begins to look like a viable opportunity for change.
And finally, we have to acknowledge the goal here isn't some immediate global utopia.
Not at all. The goal is containment and resilience. Conflict, crime, inequality, these are human and universal. Wealthy societies still have tremendous problems. They have economic inequality, political division, violent crime, but they don't collapse under them
Why not?
because they have the necessary institutional and economic buffers to absorb those shocks. The goal of economic stability in vulnerable regions is to help them reach that same level, to build a structural resilience that contains the human propensity for conflict and crime rather than amplifies it.
So what does this all mean for the timeline of policy? Because that seems to be the critical difference in why we choose destruction over building.
The uncomfortable truth about the policy preference is rooted entirely in that time dynamic. Bombs can destroy a country in a matter of months, offering immediate visible results that satisfy short political timelines.
But building one.
But it takes years, a full generation, perhaps 20 to 30 years, to build one, even with perfect execution. And that commitment to the long haul, that willingness to look past the next election cycle and invest for the next generation is exactly why building works. And it's why short-term destructive policies consistently fail. You simply cannot solve a decades-long structural problem with a 6-month military intervention.
The long game is the only game that truly matters for stability. If you enjoyed this conversation and this deep dive into why economic stability is the true engine of global security, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or new topic that you would like covered in a future video.